find it hard sometimes to explain exactly what went on the course to people who weren't on it, because it was almost as if this kind of slightly cultish atmosphere in a way that feels sometimes quite hard to describe, and it was constantly there.
Simon isn't his real name. His voice has been altered. If you're watching on YouTube, you're seeing an AI avatar deliver his actual words. Like many of the men in this series, he's asked for anonymity. The course that Simon struggles to make sense of was a 3-year doctorate in clinical psychology, funded by Britain's National Health Service, training our next generation of frontline therapists. Simon plans to help young people with psychosis. But one day, early on in the course, something happened outside a convenience store 4,000 miles away.
There was a letter that went around the department saying, please, white people, whilst George Floyd happened, lots of people were in mourning. Don't try and facilitate conversations you're not welcome to be a part of. Your black colleagues are suffering. Don't show sympathy and don't show your emotions because they might not be welcome. Being a white man on the course felt both something that I was scared to be, scared to know how I was going to be accepted, but I also didn't feel like I had any room to state that. I still remember the looks that I was given, for asking questions.
At his NHS-funded course, training clinical psychologists to work in the health service, Simon and his class were presented with a whole day dedicated to whiteness, which, like much of the ideology being imported post-George Floyd, makes no mention that Britain and America have deeply different racial histories and attitudes. I've seen a presentation from that day which describes whiteness as an invisible racial ideology, and twice mentions the term eugenics, the sort of selective breeding to form a master race that Hitler was so fond of. How's that being taught to anyone, let alone health professionals?
The thesis was kind of like, we call whiteness is a sort of an ideology, is what she would call it in herself. Something perpetuated by people in a position of power, almost suggesting that what we do as individuals is wake up in the morning and I, a white man, think, how can I best progress the power base of other white men like me, heteronormative men like me, and anyone putting their hand up to sort of say, are the limitations on this, which I did do, it would be looked at as kind of like, why have you, white man, got a problem with talking about white men having power? And there's that feeling of being on your own and that maybe I am going mad, or maybe I am a racist, or maybe I have got something that I'm missing to not really be going along with this stuff. The thesis was kind of like, we call whiteness is a sort of an ideology, is what she would call it in herself. Something perpetuated by people in a position of power, almost suggesting that what we do as individuals is wake up in the morning and I, a white man, think, how can I best progress the power base of other white men like me, heteronormative men like me, and anyone putting their hand up to sort of say, are the limitations on this, which I did do, it would be looked at as kind of like, why have you, white man, got a problem with talking about white men having power? And there's that feeling of being on your own and that maybe I am going mad, or maybe I am a racist, or maybe I have got something that I'm missing to not really be going along with this stuff. There was a white girl on the course who put her hand up and said, I think sometimes it's useful for people to be talking about their own cultures, and we don't need necessarily more white men to be telling us about cultures they don't belong to. And I remember thinking, is she suggesting we can't share cultures, or is she suggesting that this is just another white man? But I was wondering what the reaction of the facilitators, the senior psychologist, was going to be, but they just kind of went, that's such a good point.
A day of whiteness training would have been one thing, but Simon says the whole 3-year course had been captured by that oppressor obsession.
I remember thinking to myself, what does power mean, really? And sometimes you'd find this intersectionality wheel would come back again. White people having power, black people not having power, men having power, women not having power. And I remember just thinking, like, this is so limited.
Something stark was certainly being missed.
We were on the course for 3 years as a doctorate level course. A very responsible position was something we were being trained up to walk into when we finished, and yet we didn't really have a conversation on the whole 3 years about men's mental health.
Just going back to, in this 3-year course for clinical psychology, you're saying the discussions around men's mental health barely got a look in, despite the fact that there are some terrible mental health rates, and we all know that suicide's the biggest killer of men under about 45. Huge, profound needs around addiction, homelessness, self-abuse. Doesn't get a mention.
It was not talked about explicitly. We had a day on feminism. We'd had a day on intersectional feminism. There were so many different things we covered. We never covered men's mental health. We're going off into the world of the NHS and healthcare systems, not thinking about why are these problems happening for men. I felt pretty dehumanized. Just by uttering a few questions, people were immediately making judgments about who I was. I could feel people giving me a sort of cold shoulder. People who I'd gotten on well with before were now thinking, this guy, who is he exactly? Even just talking to you now, Tim, it brings things up for me, and it's not always completely easy to keep things straight in my head because there's a lot of emotion. Feeling that you're around people, feeling that you've put yourself into training for a profession that you've given so much of your time in.
I don't know how Simon made it through those 3 years, but why should he and others have to endure this? How does it help patients? Where are the gatekeepers? Why hasn't someone said, hold on, we're training mental health professionals. Let's keep ideology out of this. Let's focus on evidence-based approaches, and let's give a shit about men who are dying in shocking numbers. My go-to therapist, Carol Sherwood, has been hammering away at this for years, campaigning for the NHS and governing bodies to depoliticise therapy training and ditch the mandatory DEI policies imposed on clinical psychology training courses by NHS England.
This is not good for mental health. This is not good for anybody's mental health. Not only the people who are white, who are being accused of being, oppressors and dominant and bad, basically. It's not good for those in ethnic groups who are being told they're powerless to do anything about this because it's white people who are responsible, and they're just victims. In therapy, you would never tell somebody you're a victim, and you would never tell somebody that you have privilege and power and that what is happening in society is all your fault. So this is incredibly anti-therapeutic. What is happening now is so uncomfortable because we're having a theory or an ideology imposed on our society, both here and in the US in particular, which says that actually all white people are inherently racist. Now, we've not heard this before. This feels quite new. It has been around, this idea, since about the 70s or 80s, but it's now entered the mainstream